Welcome all, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Aliyev Watch, where we will be looking at some of the statements and actions made by Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev. I'm joined again by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian to unpack the Azerbaijani longtime leader's statements and various talking points. Eric, thank you for your time. Today we'll be looking at two appearances the president made. The first is an interview with France 24 in the midst of the Second Karabakh War, and the second is a speech by Aliyev at the Global Baku Forum, which took place about a week ago. So let's start with the France 24 interview, which was aired on October 15th, 2020, in the midst of the war. So Eric, have a listen to this.
I'm asking you today, is that ceasefire officially now dead, over and null and void?
It depends on the behavior of Armenia, because we are always committed to our responsibility, and the decision to announce a ceasefire on humanitarian grounds, as you know, came from Russia, and we supported it because I think it was the right decision in order to exchange the bodies of the dead soldiers and also hostages, and also to continue the activity on the negotiation table. We were observing the ceasefire, but as you know, Armenia brutally violated it.
So Eric, the interviewer is referencing one of the ceasefires which were brokered during the Second Karabakh War. Oftentimes it's forgotten there was a Russian brokered one, a US brokered one, and a European brokered one, all of which fell through. Most military analysts pin Azerbaijan as the violator of the ceasefire, and we can see this by Azerbaijani forces constantly advancing and having victories. So it would seem that Aliyev was almost accepting a ceasefire and then ordering his troops to advance. So what do you think when you hear Aliyev saying, we supported the ceasefire and Armenia violates it?
Well, obviously it's a lie, but that's really not that's not what is relevant here. I think what is relevant here is who was the shot caller on violating the ceasefires, because the first one, which was the key one, which I believe was on the 10th or 9th or 10th, which was the one in which was brokered by Lavrov. And I think even Putin was part of it for 5 or 6 hours for the negotiations. And in a most normal setting, when you have Putin himself on that level involved in negotiations, that should be the end of it. And Aliyev would not dare contradict him on a setup like that, unless the shot caller was actually not him in this case, and it was Erdogan. And I think all of these ceasefires were violated essentially on the direct orders or instructions of Ankara. So what he's trying to hide here is not simply the fact that they lied, is the fact that he was simply a patsy, and the real shot caller is actually the man in Ankara and not himself. So I think this is what's relevant out of this specific statement.
And following on from that, Aliyev has made multiple statements to various Western media outlets, pinning that Armenia started the Second Karabakh War. What do you think when you hear that narrative of Armenia starting the 2020 war?
Well, I mean, it's absurd. Armenia was the position that Armenia had before the war. You have that advantageous position. You have absolutely no reason to start the war. So it almost, fails the most basic reason test of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense.
Okay, let's listen to the next talking point.
We never deliberately attacked civilians in any city or village on the occupied territories. Our targets were only military installations.
So Aliyev states here that Azerbaijan never deliberately attacks civilians. He almost is trying to portray the Azerbaijani armed forces as a force that conducts conflict very ethically and never with a high concern for Armenian civilian life. At the same time, we have seen videos of the way many Azerbaijani soldiers behaved during the war, including beheading elderly civilians. So what did you think when you heard this?
Well, I mean, obviously it isn't true, but that doesn't even need to be said. You just have to understand in the context that terrorizing civilians was one of the central focuses of the war. In fact, it's still one of the central focuses of their state policies, to terrorize Armenians, and part of it, Armenians of Artsakh in this case. And that was not simply, not only is his denial fake and not true, terror and terror of civilians and murder of civilians and the intimidation of civilians was state policy, and a very deliberate one, because it's designed not to create it's to put people in a frame of mind that this is an existential issue and I need to fear and I need to escape. The whole idea, it's the central core of ethnic cleansing, in which you do, essentially jihadist type violence to intimidate people, or ISIS type violence, which is what happened by the Azeri occupation forces in their attack on the Azerbaijani Republic.
Okay, let's listen to the next one.
What about the pictures of bombings on churches inside Nagorno-Karabakh? Those are not military targets, surely?
Yes, you're right. We're investigating that issue. I'd like to say that Azerbaijan is a country with a very high level of religious tolerance. We are not sure about what happened. We have doubts that that could have been done by Armenians in order to blame us.
So apart from the Shushi Cathedral as well, it is worth noting that Katarovang, the church in Mataghis, the Ganansham church, the chapel in Jebrail Vankasar, they were all desecrated. But he then goes on to say that it could have been Armenians themselves that destroyed the Shushi Cathedral. This would be strange considering that 11 people in total were injured in the cathedral when it was shelled. What do you think of this conspiracy theory that Armenians conducted the attack?
Yeah, I mean, yes, because it's like going to court and you punch someone in the face and you try to defend yourself by saying they punched themselves in the face. I mean, it's farcical on the face of it. I think, but this is actually a very key point, specifically about the Shushi Cathedral, because that cathedral was attacked twice by long-range rockets, which means this was a deliberate act, multiple times. And also a church obviously has no military value. So this actually tells you a lot about the mindset. There's this there was a play during the Nazi period in Germany, and there's a famous line in it, and it says that one of the characters says, every time I hear the word culture, I want to reach for my gun. And I think what you're really seeing here, the deliberate attack on a church or a cultural site, tells you about the nature of the regime and the nature of the intentions, because if the object is to drive people out, you drive people out. When you attack a cultural site, it's genocidal intent. And that's the motivation. And you've seen it over the years. I mean, in Nakhchivan, where there was the, historical landmarks and the thousands of khachkars that they destroyed deliberately. There's not a single Armenian landmark left in Nakhchivan. It was deliberately destroyed. So I think what you're really seeing here, this war on culture, in many ways, that church is really the Guernica of the 21st century. And it's a very symbolic thing. And the attacks on it not only reveal the horrors of war, but also reveals the intentions of the aggressor in this case, which is at its core fascistic and genocidal in nature.
Okay, let's listen to the next point, which is about the Syrian mercenaries.
You've called for an apology from Emmanuel Macron after his remarks saying that 300 fighters from Syria had been brought to fight for your side.
I was still waiting for evidence. No evidence was presented to me.
So, Eric, there is evidence, though, with regards to this issue. Armenian soldiers have captured and taken prisoner Syrian mercenaries. There is video footage of soldiers speaking Arabic in Karabakh among the corpses of Armenian soldiers. Journalists have documented that in Syria's Idlib region, in particular, Syrian fighters from various fundamentalist legions have been transported to Karabakh. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service even stated that Jabhat al-Nusra fighters were transported, whose previous name was Al-Qaeda in Syria. What does the fact that he denied this say about the man? Also, what does the fact that he was willing to bring Syrian fundamentalist jihadists to Karabakh say about Mr. Aliyev, who claims to be a secular and tolerant man?
Well, I think it tells you about the insecurities of the regime, because this is a regime that was afraid of the number of casualties that were going to come out of the war. And let's not forget, all of these mercenaries and these terrorists were transported by our neighboring NATO country, Turkey. They were the ones that were facilitators of this headcutters and murderers being transported to Artsakh. It's also this was also an issue of terror, because this is, when you talk about terrorizing civilians, jihadist headcutters are far more better at intimidating civilians than any soldiers from any random country. So this is also an element of terror, of bringing in people who implicated in the horrors of the Syrian war. But I think mostly anything that takes away from the glory of his victory, which is all about himself, and obviously the fact that the regime is so insecure that it has to bring in these people who, for the most part, most military experts will tell you, are not particularly useful. They're essentially cannon fodder, one, and then two, they're used as terror elements to terrorize civilians. So obviously he's going to deny it, but the facts are undeniable because some of these people are actually serving life sentences in Armenia right now. This was also confirmed by U.S. intelligence. It was also confirmed by French intelligence. So there's no question about the role of the jihadists that were brought there and who brought them and what purpose they were brought in. But obviously he's going to deny it because it highlights the weakness and the insecurity of the regime that didn't want to face for every Syrian terrorist dying, it's one less Azeri soldier dying.
Mm. And let's listen to the next point, which is about Turkish military involvement.
France's Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian has said that there is Turkish military involvement which risks internationalization of this conflict. Is he wrong about that?
Yes, he's wrong about that. Turkish military involvement is another fake news. There is no military involvement of Turkey. We are using Turkish military equipment. This is true, but we are using military equipment of Russia, military equipment of Israel, military equipment of other countries.
So there is evidence, however, again, like the previous point, that Turkish officers led Azerbaijani soldiers in multiple offensives, particularly in the Garintak-Shushi offensive. Moreover, many military analysts believe that Turkey was heavily involved on the Azerbaijani side. He denies it. What do you think of Turkey's role?
Well, first of all, denials would mean nothing, but this is much bigger than that. In fact, you have to go back. This war actually started from the July incidents in Tavush, after Azeri forces were routed and humiliated, and a general got killed, and all of these things that led to these demonstrations in Baku demanding a start of the war. So the war actually started that day. The war became inevitable that day. And essentially what Aliyev did post-July is to take the car keys of his army and hand it over to the Turks, essentially to the Turkish command, down to the lowest levels in their military formations. And this has been documented. But this is an exceptionally sensitive issue for him. It's not the question of the Turks. It's a question of if after spending $20 billion and all of this money and all of this bravado, you still cannot build an army that doesn't need to be led by foreign troops, what does it say about your governance? So I think this is something that goes to the heart of it. It's not a question he wants to deflect the Turkish role, but any Turkish role, and the very clear, which is something that everybody knows, essentially humiliates him. Because what have you done for 25 years if you need to have, you need to have another country's army run your army? What does that say about what you have done for the past 25 years? So this is a very touchy subject. Now, I noticed this as soon as this issue comes up, all the trolls that they have go crazy. But the Turks themselves try to back away from this, but everybody knows about this involvement, and it's essentially was led by the general incompetence of his own command, which is the reason that the Turkish army literally had to run his army during this war.
Okay, so now let's move on to the Baku Global Forum, which took place, I think about 2 weeks ago in the Azerbaijani capital. Guests from around the world, many former presidents and prime ministers, were in participation.
Azerbaijan won the war. The war was just. The war was inevitable, and it led to restoration of justice, international law, and national dignity of Azerbaijani people. Now we talk about peace, and I think it's one of the unique cases in the world that after such a long-lasting confrontation, within a short period of time, the country which restored justice and defeated aggressor offers peace. If you look at the history of wars, not in many cases one can see this.
So I want your reaction, but I also want to mention and get your reaction to this. This forum was in participation were many former presidents and prime ministers of Georgia, Malta, Croatia, Israel, Bulgaria, Albania, Latvia, Saudi, Belgium. The list goes on. It was really quite a dais. So, I mean, what did you think when you saw this hall full of world leaders?
First of all, let's go back to what he said, which is there's no there. I don't think, you know, he's saying that there's never been a precedent of the winning side and the losing side negotiating a peace. Well, that every war is nothing but that. So I have no idea what he's talking about. He's obviously, this is just uttering nonsense. As far as the world leaders being there, we should not be surprised at all, because I would say there's three reasons for that. One of them is that our side has done such a poor job of demonizing him and showing him out to be there's no cost, there's no price to be paid for any world leaders to be in league or in the proximity of this degenerate. And that's our fault. Secondly is the fact that they have a diplomatic service that's far superior to ours and statecraft that's superior to ours. They've actually managed to make a very poor case very well in the world scheme of things. So they deserve credit on that. And the third one is, you know, the gallows list of despots. Let's take, I mean, the best comparison of Aliyev is actually Lukashenko. You know, both post-Soviet, both dictatorial, both somewhat thuggish, and, you know, say everything that comes to their mind. But Lukashenko is a complete outcast. Even though I can make the case that the Lukashenko regime is actually less repressive than the Azeri one, and certainly it is not genocidal in language or actions like the Azeri one. So the difference is this, that bad guys list is not based on your actions. It's based on to the extent that you contradict Western interests, whether it's economic or political. So to join the Saddams and the Gaddafis and the Assads, which obviously Aliyev well deserves to be a part of, he would need to contradict Western interests, which he never has done that. And until he does that, it'll be very hard to put him on that list. But we can obviously, by exposing his degeneracy and thuggery and just putting it under the light as we're doing here, you can actually make it more costly for a lot of more legitimate people to break bread with him.
Okay, let's listen to the next one.
With respect to the opening of communications for Azerbaijan to have connection with its autonomous republic of Nakhchivan. Unfortunately, it's more than 1.5 years since Armenia signed the Capitulation Act, but so far there is no access. And this is unacceptable.
So in the November 9th trilateral statement, there was also a call for the release of all prisoners of war, which hasn't been fulfilled by Azerbaijan. It called for troops to stop in their tracks, which Azerbaijan didn't do in December 2020 when it took the area of Khazabert and Hintarer. But he is vexed about this future access route between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan, which is an exclave of Azerbaijan. Armenia has released all Azerbaijani POWs. Armenian troops have stopped in their tracks since 2020, and it has withdrawn from the Kelbajar, Aghdam, Lachin, Kubadlu regions of Karabakh. So what is he complaining about exactly?
We're better off asking him, but I think it's there's two words here. He says capitulation. He doesn't say ceasefire, which actually is true. But in diplomatic circles, that's not the phrase that you use. So it tells you about the level of this person, that he doesn't even hide his colors in any way. Yeah. Secondly, there was nothing about a corridor in the November 9th agreement. It was about opening up transportation corridors, which everyone agrees with. You know, which means trains go through Armenia. Their trains go to through our tracks, our trains go through their tracks, all kinds of roads open. So this is what he's actually claiming is nonsensical. There was no such thing for a corridor. The corridor is the, you know, the piece of flesh that he wants out of this process, which he's not likely to get, which vexes him for different reasons, because listen, this is a man who has nothing to go in for him. He cannot deliver anything to his people. And this constant conflict, this continuation of this conflict that he has a vested interest in, this is just the latest thing. And if he gets a quarter, then he's going to ask for something else. So he cannot let go of this conflict, because the entire legitimacy of his regime, that has no legitimacy based on the fact that his poor people are the poorest people in the Caucasus, despite the fact that they have the most resources, and that most of his population have absolutely no agency and have no freedoms whatsoever. So this is all he has. So the particular issue is not relevant. It's the fact that he needs an issue, and he needs an issue that he can have in conflict with Armenia. But there's nothing in the November 9th agreement about any kind of, he's just straight out lying. There's really nothing more to it than that.
Okay, let's listen to the next one.
Issues related to Armenians who live in Azerbaijan. Rights and security of Armenian population in Karabakh also will be taken into account. And we fully support it. And rights of security of all people of Azerbaijan are provided by our constitution. Azerbaijan is a multi-ethnic country. Unfortunately, we start to hear from Armenian government words about status of so-called Nagorno-Karabakh, which is absolutely counterproductive and which is dangerous for Armenia itself, because Nagorno-Karabakh do not exist. Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous district was abolished in the end of 1991 by the decision of Azerbaijani parliament. And we don't have this administrative structure on our territory. Therefore, any kind of reference to so-called status will lead only to new confrontation.
So he literally mentions that the rights of Armenians will be respected in Azerbaijan, and a few minutes later goes on to threaten a new conflict if Armenia keeps talking about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. He says Nagorno-Karabakh doesn't exist. And then a few minutes after that, he threatens the whole of southern Armenia, claiming that Azerbaijan can make territorial claims on Armenia if Armenia makes territorial claims on Azerbaijan. So the representative of the European Union, other officials, lauded Aliyev for calling for peace in this speech, but they didn't mention the threats. So what did you think of these threats?
Well, as far as the Europeans are concerned, it's our job to call them on it. Yeah, they can say whatever they want. So if they said that, it's the job of our diplomacy to call them on it. I think the genesis of this is his fiction after the war that this issue has been solved, there's nothing to talk about, and it's over. I've solved it. I mean, when you say there's no such thing as Karabakh, really? It existed in all conversations for the, I mean, it's almost ridiculous to say a place that exists doesn't exist, which I think this is the way he wants it, because it's this fiction that he's created that there's nothing to talk about. I've solved the issue, done. So anything that talks about status, anything that talks about the rights or the human rights of people in Artsakh, it contradicts that. As far as his threats, this is typical that we've been hearing from him as far as Armenia was given Sunik or this and that. Well, that's simply nonsensical. In fact, historically, it's Nakhchivan that was gifted to Azerbaijan based on Turkish insistence with their deals with the Bolsheviks. So this is what he's absolutely saying is nonsensical, and again making aggressive claims on Armenia proper territory. So it's very hard to take this kind of discourse seriously. I think our job is not to find out the specifics of his lies, to be honest with you. Because, he lies as often as a child, does something in their diapers. I mean, this is just natural to him. The only issue is here how you call him out on it and how you expose him, constantly put him under the spotlight of these dual track Aliyev, as I call it, the localized, gangster version, which he speaks in Azeri, Turkish, and other things, and then sort of the international, suave leader that he speaks in English. So our job is to actually, mix these and essentially expose his contradictions. As far as the specifics, they're about as nonsensical as all the other things that he says.
But do you feel like he almost knows how to play a Western audience or Western listener? I mean, he denies any human rights violation. He almost knows what to say. Do you think he thinks he's the smartest person in the room?
Of course. What dictator doesn't think they're the smartest person in the room? But he's also, he knows, he understands, I mean, the sort of the cultural buzzwords of the moment, you know, tolerance, diversity, you know, he talks about, he knows that, that Western code language. But again, you can't blame him for talking in that code language. Everybody speaks in that code language. What this exposes is our incompetence in not being able to expose his contradictions and the fact that he's a pathological liar.
Okay, Eric, well, thank you for joining us in another edition of Aliyev Watch.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.